good morning, or afternoon, or evening, or night, whatever it is for you. Um, I wanted to make this video to, um, well, I think it'd be useful for it as a resource for whoever might find it useful, and I think it generally is a required, it's something that's very lacking in society today. And so what I wanted to talk about is traditional virtues. And the most immediate reason why this has come up in my mind is for Halloween, for October, I reread Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from, what is, I don't know the exact date, let's say 1820, about 200 years old. And I'm currently rereading Bram Stoker's Dracula. I'm like 60 pages away from the end. It's a 400-page book. And it just struck me how different the Victorian culture was. And it led me down this kind of rabbit hole of trying to think more about it, but also just buy some books. So I bought Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I haven't opened it because I'm still in the middle of Dracula, and well, I also realized that University of Toronto archive.org, there's a University of Toronto library, and you can basically download PDFs of like the vast majority of classic books: Dostoevsky, Grimm Brothers, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, a lot of authors who are classical authors. So it struck me while reading Frankenstein, for instance. The book starts out with the narrative of the explorer sailor who he's kind of complaining that he has this intellectual passion, and he has this, well, honestly, in the Victorian era there was a lot of focus on your breeding, I guess, for lack of a better word. In fact, the Frankenstein creature even says at some point that men are made of two things: their wealth and their breed. And since I have neither, this is a creature talking. Since I have neither, my life is completely meaningless. I am worth less than a dog. He says something like that. And so, at the beginning of Frankenstein, you're told by this explorer sailor that he has this intellectual passion. He's noble. He has these virtues. He one of the most important Victorian virtues was this like denying of short-term happiness in the pursuit of like work and long-term developmental things that lead to some form of happiness or life fulfillment. And so at the beginning of the book, this explorer sailor, he's basically saying, I haven't met anyone who has the intellectual passion that I have, and I come from a noble blood. I come from good breeding, and my family are hardworking, virtuous people, and it's just impossible. I've never met anyone like me. And so the story starts out where he's basically saying that's why he has this obsession with visiting. I forget if it's the Arctic or the Antarctic, but I think it's the Arctic because they kind of travel there from wherever they're at. But anyway, yeah, so he has this obsession with like discovering something that's never been discovered, and with this just passion to make a mark on society and to just pursue his like career, his interests. And at some point, of course, he meets Victor Frankenstein, who is chasing after the creature to kill the creature. I'm not going to spoil the whole story, but and then you hear Victor Frankenstein's story, and the narrative switches over to Victor Frankenstein. He's the doctor who creates the Frankenstein creature. And basically then you hear the same thing again, but from Victor Frankenstein. He comes from this noble, well-bred blood. He has all these Victorian virtues. You hear about his father who has these Victorian virtues. He's hardworking. He doesn't allow himself like short-term happiness or fun or those types of things that you're supposed to deny yourself in the pursuit of career or love or family or the intellectual passions. And Victor tells about his father, how his father, I don't completely remember everything, but I remember that his father's just a very virtuous person. He just works very hard, and at some point, one of his friend falls into poverty, and he helps out his friend, and then his friend dies, and he leaves a daughter who's much younger than he is, Victor's father. But he kind of like, I don't know, falls in love with her and feels this responsibility, because in the Victorian culture, men had responsibility to take care of women, and yeah, so he feels this responsibility. He has to like now take care of her, and he falls in love with her, and that's Victor's mother. And then you similarly have the same story kind of for Victor. He says he has this intellectual passion, he has these virtues, he has this good breeding, and it goes in detail about Elizabeth, how Elizabeth was found like in a poor like community home for like orphans, but it says that she's very different than all the other orphans. She's fair, she's from like a noble blood, she's from a higher class family, and it's just by complete coincidence that her family ran into issues and she ended up in this orphanage. And so that's when Victor's family adopts her, and she becomes basically Victor's love interest for the rest of the story. And it's kind of like highlighted that it's almost like his family picked her out like to be just for him, and that she's virtuous, she's of noble blood, she's fair, these things. And so just reading Frankenstein, you're if you're familiar at all with Victorian culture or Victorian virtues, you're struck by the characters displaying their virtues. Victor's like main passion is to read. He wants to discover the secrets of people in the past. He wants to use modern technology, modern science to kind of further the ideas of people in the past, and that's what leads him to experiment on like creating life. So and the same thing is kind of true in Dracula. You're told that the characters are just very virtuous people. They don't, at least the main characters, the characters you're supposed to identify with, they're characters who do not pursue short-term fun. They do not pursue popular. Popular, by the way, if you're not familiar with like, I don't even know where you would read this, like postmodernism, the Great Divide, like high-class culture versus popular culture. There's kind of this difference of highbrow culture, things that require a lot of effort that maybe aren't so fun, but if you stick with them, you kind of develop this experience, this culture, this refinement that eventually leads you to fulfillment. And then there's the lowbrow popular culture, which are things that give you instant gratification. So today that would be like video games, music, movies, series on TV. I think of like going to bars and clubs. I tried going to a club on Halloween, and I was just completely, I want to say disgusting, but that's a harsh word. It's just not a culture that I identify with. Dancing, having fun, listening to popular music, talking about sex, and the pursuit of fun just for fun's sake. So postmodernism, the Great Divide, Victorian virtue, it tells you that fun, enjoyment, they're like fleeting things that are for popular they're popular. They're for the lowbrow people. Um, and that if you want to be virtuous, that's not what you want. You want things that are not popular. You want things that take a lot of effort, that take a lot of refinement, that are cultured, that are what's the word? Like gate kept. Like you know, you don't just want to go out and read any book. You read the books that like very well respected scholars tell you to read. They're gatekeepers. Anyway, so yeah, and Dracula. By the way, one thing that I think people miss a lot is the moral catharsism, the moral messages that are in stories. So in Dracula, you have you see most of the main characters are virtuous, but some of them are less virtuous, and you see them like punished in the story for not being virtuous. For instance, the main character Lucy, one of the main characters, Lucy, she's kind of like courting three men at once, and she's kind of like it doesn't tell you clearly that she's giving them all signals that she's interested in them, but it's kind of assumed that she's kind of flirting around with these three men and kind of all trying to convince them to be in love with her. And in the movie adaptation, it's much more clear that she's kind of like flirting around with them and kind of manipulating them, honestly. And so she's not very virtuous. That's not very ladylike, according to Victorian virtues. There is a double standard in Victorian culture, in like traditional Western Protestant like value systems. There is a double standard. Women are supposed to kind of like hold off on any emotional or intimate connections until she's found the one, and that's the standard. That's like that Madonna whore dichotomy. That's what's supposed to be upheld, because men are the pursuers, women are the choosers, and that's the women's goal in Victorian culture, is to choose, to finally, find the one that's good enough to choose, and that's it. There is no like licentiousness or whatever you might call it. So the main character Lucy, one of the main characters Lucy, she's kind of like courting around all these guys, giving them mixed messages. And so she's punished. She's punished by being bitten by Dracula and turned into a vampire. She basically becomes evil. And she starts killing children. And they have to kill her. And they have to take her, cut off her head, and stick a wood stake into her heart to completely kill her soul. Because she's just completely evil at that point. And that's kind of like the moral message. One of the moral messages of the story is if you don't uphold like female Victorian chastity and modesty, and what's another word for just being very reserved? Then you've made a moral error. And so that's kind of what the story's telling you. And you can look at a lot of movies and stories and find like moral messages. For instance, I watched the Jaws showing 2 months ago or something. And there was a clear moral message. I even took notes on it in my little notebook. There's a moral message. It's the beginning, the teens who die. They're the ones who are going out partying, maybe doing drugs, maybe drinking alcohol, but they're going out. They're with, the guys are meeting up with girls, the girls are meeting up with guys. So that's like a moral error. That's not virtuous. And so they're killed. The girl is killed because there is a double standard in most of Western culture. There's a double standard. The men are pursuers and the women are choosers. And so a woman who allows herself to be too intimate, to be too available, she's committed a moral sin. And so at the beginning of Jaws, that's the girl who dies at the beginning. She's going out partying and meeting guys. And the next kid who dies in the story is his mother is in a book at the beach. All the other mothers are kind of like watching their children, but his mother is just reading a book, like completely distracted from watching her child. And so that's kind of like a moral message: is if you're not watching your child, if you're too absorbed in a book, nowadays it would be your phone. If you're too absorbed in something and not paying attention to your children, then that's a moral sin. And in the movie, it's punished by your kid dies from Jaws, from the shark. Yeah, so I suppose I just wanted to kind of lay that framework down, that Victorian literature, specifically just Frankenstein and Dracula, because that's what I've read, but I'm sure most of Victorian literature teaches you these Victorian virtues, these traditional virtues. I think one of my first experiences with it was, I think it's called The Problem with Pleasure. I'm forgetting the author now, but it was called The Problem with Pleasure. It was just about postmodernism, and it just kind of went through these postmodern fiction. Postmodernism, I think it's like I want to say the 40s to the 70s or something. I'm not completely sure, but it's not too long ago, but it's long ago enough that they still upheld like traditional values, traditional virtues. And so the book The Problem with Pleasure basically just laid out, here's postmodernism, here are the main ideas of postmodernism, and it correlates very strongly with Victorian virtues, traditional Victorian virtues, that you have the things in life that really lead you to have success and satisfaction and lead you to be like a virtuous person are the things that take a lot of effort, that aren't so fun, that aren't so popular. And in fact, those fun, popular things are bad for you. They lead you to be an unvirtuous person. Yeah, so that's mainly just what I wanted to say. I have read an author, Gertrude Himmelfarb. She is basically an expert on Victorian literature. I read her book. I forget the exact name. It's something like One Nation, Two Cultures. And it's just like it was actually like 5 or 6 years ago now. I don't remember much about the book. I just remember that it said a lot about how traditional values are being replaced by popular, liberal, just values that tell you to live your life for fun, to not commit, to not marry, or if you do marry, to not be committed, to divorce. All these like liberal values. Gertrude Himmelfarb is basically trying to say that a lot of these don't lead you to actually be all that healthy, to be all that happy, to be very virtuous, to be like a good citizen. And so maybe it would be good to like bring back like traditional Victorian values. And so yeah, I've read a lot of what she's written, but I haven't finished a lot of books besides that one. But she has tons of books about just Victorian virtues. So it's a very big topic, and I do want to read more Victorian literature. That's kind of one of my goals right now. I downloaded tons of PDFs from University of Toronto Library Archive.org, and I advise other people to do so. One of the things I've noticed is that most of society today, I don't know the number, I want to say like 99.9%, just doesn't read, doesn't care about learning. And so, for instance, if what you have today are like TikTok videos, Instagram videos, I don't know, popular series on online streaming services, and I don't know, fun music, popular music, then like the Victorian virtues of like denying yourself those types of short-term fun, and instead pursuing like deeper things. Um, I just feel like it's obvious that that's what people need right now. People are spending all their time chasing after celebrity news and political news, biased news, and um, it's just the case that I feel like people would be smarter, people would be more virtuous if they just read more books instead of whatever it is that they do on their phones. Um, but yeah, for instance, out of like the nonfiction authors that I've read, who I find are very intelligent people, who I've learned a lot from, um, like basically no one I've met, even at university, has like read any of them. I think I remember in one class, in my cultural anthropology class, there was one girl who read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, and she didn't like it. So I don't know how deeply she read it, if she read related works, or what she got out of it, but that's basically one person out of, I don't know, thousands that I've met between work and school. And basically, yeah, one person has read Jared Diamond. One professor was reading Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker's a pretty good author. I remember a couple students were reading just random pop science books, like Malcolm Gladwell, or who was the other? It was some very popular economist, very kind of like a mainstream liberal economist. I didn't think much of it. Talking to Zombies or something. And pop science, certainly it can get your foot in the door to reading real science, like deeper books. But yeah, it's just not the same as reading like Jared Diamond or any other like really good authors. Edward Wilson, Paul Ehrlich, um, yeah, Sarah Blafer Hardy, Roy Baumeister, Joseph Henrik, the weirdest people in the world. I'm rereading Deirdre Barrett, Supernormal Stimuli. Um, Very great book, but like to read Supernormal Stimuli, you'd have to like be able to understand basic evolutionary principles of how biology is made and why it has the designs that it has. And I would say less than 1 in 10 people who I've met are even familiar enough with evolutionary principles to even acknowledge that like they're as scientifically accurate as can be, and that they guide like organisms and our behavior and animal behavior. So it's a very small number of people who have even just read like basic books on evolution, on like basic biology. So yeah. So this is, I think this is like a sign of our society right now, is that like less than 1 in 1,000 people has even read Jared Diamond, who's like one of the most reputable, intelligent science authors. So I don't know how many people have read Deirdre Barrett or Sarah Blafer Hardy or Roy Baumeister, but it's almost certainly less than 1 in 1,000 because Jared Diamond is the most popular. More people have read Malcolm Gladwell, I'm sure, but it's just not like very good science. And one of the reasons I say that, so I read Talking to Strangers not too long ago. I'm about 20 pages from finishing it. I just didn't really want to finish it. The first half of the book is basically narrative stories about different people. So what you may not know is using case studies to explain scientific principles is just flawed. What you need is statistics, controlled statistics preferably, natural experiments. Jared Diamond almost specializes in natural experiments. You look at two people, two cultures, two groups of people who basically are the same except for one interesting variable that you want to study. So a lot of these pop science books are not telling you like the deeper statistical truths that you would only find if you ran a lot of controlled experiments or did natural experiments or all kinds of other things that relate to statistics. And instead they tell you case studies. Look at this one person and how their personality was like this, and this is how their life ended up. And it's kind of trying to tell you that, you know, this personality leads to that. Um, and it's just not good science. It's case studies. Narratives are just not good science. They're interesting, and if they get your foot in the door to read good science, then that's good. But it's not the same as, like, I mean, if you would read Steven Pinker's book Rationality, or Mindware by Richard Nisbett, or Redirect by Timothy Wilson, a lot of like good science books basically tell you, like, you can't trust narratives, you can't trust case studies, you can't trust common sense. You have to run statistical natural experiments, controlled experiments preferably. But yeah, so yeah, to read like Deirdre Barrett, you'd have to be familiar enough to know that like evolution designed us to do this, and so like these are the natural things that men are attracted to, these are natural things that women are attracted to, yada yada yada. And it's just such a small proportion of society is even capable or has the experience to have read any books on biology or evolution or anthropology, cultural anthropology, to be able to just like rationally assess like supernormal stimuli by Deirdre Barrett. So it's very unfortunate our times right now, and yeah, I just think so few people read books, so few people are virtuous, honestly. It could be more. It could be that those virtuous people who are modest and work hard, they care more about reading and learning and working hard than they do about having fun. Maybe they're just all at home and we just don't see them. But it seems to be that the vast majority of people, my coworkers, the students I've been around, they're just not virtuous. They just could be that when you're young, you're not very virtuous. Maybe when you get older, you get more virtuous. That could be true too. But it is just a cultural thing that you're just raised nowadays to care about yourself, to want to have fun, to live life for sex, and to not commit, to just not care about learning and reading. Yeah, so I think that's like what society needs right now. Is for people to become more virtuous, people to read more books generally, preferably good science, and maybe some Victorian literature, Frankenstein and Dracula, if that leads you to see like how to be virtuous, how to be a good person. And yeah, that's about it. What else? I did want to say something about well, so in browsing the University of Toronto Library, archive.org, I did stumble upon a book that caught my eye. And I've heard this book mentioned a lot of times. So I remember, I think it was 5 years ago, before the COVID pandemic, but during a lot of racial topics that were blowing up on the media. I remember I wanted to learn more about like why would racism exist? Why would people be so racist? And I started out by reading like just books on evolution, generally, like, and then you'll read about in-group out-group biases, those types of things. I read Nita Jablonski's book about skin color. You know, why is fair skin good for this? Why is dark skin good for that? And how now that we move all over the world, our skin does not match our environment, and yada yada. And then I read Glenn Lowry, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. I'm trying to reread it now, but I've noticed that ever since I started taking notes, I'm less capable of just picking up a book and reading it. I kind of want to take my time, which means that I spend a lot less time reading, actually, unfortunately. But yeah, Glenn Lowry, the Anatomy of Racial Inequality, he basically just goes into detail about how we maybe incorrectly use skin color as like a signifier of your cultural background. We do this for all kinds of things, judging by the brand of your clothing or the style of your clothing, maybe the way you do your hair, if you have tattoos or piercings or don't. It kind of does give us a window into your culture or your personality. and it's very often incorrect, but it's a heuristic. It's correct, maybe better than chance amount of the time, enough that we do it, and it's somewhat rational to do it. But it does create in Glenn Lowry's The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, he calls it like a virtual identity, a virtual social identity, because it's not real necessarily, but it's based on social psychology, social principles. Yeah, so The Anatomy of Racial Inequality goes into detail about how if we have these visible signifiers of our culture and personality, or at least that people interpret to be signifiers of our culture and personality, then it can create these like feedback effects where he says, like, for instance, if in an urban city, if now this book was written 25 years ago, maybe it was more correct to be able to just write openly about this topic then than it is now. But he says, for instance, if there is discrimination by taxi drivers, that they, for whatever reason, it could be nonsense, it could be based somewhat on fact, although very like bastardized version of fact. If in fact taxi drivers do discriminate and they don't like to pick up black people, and what that means is that the average black person will realize that they won't have very good luck with taxis, and so what will happen is it creates this feedback effect where so the taxi drivers are afraid of being robbed, basically. But if you're a perfectly good, perfectly normal black person, then you're obviously not going to rob a taxi. But those people realize that they're not going to have very good luck with taxis, and so they don't bother even getting a taxi. And what you end up with is, in fact, it could be that most of the people who black people who taxi drivers would pick up might in fact rob them, because all the normal black people don't bother getting a taxi. So that's what the Anatomy of Racial Inequality basically says. You can apply this same topic to the same concept to like academic performance, if or job performance. If there's discrimination that exists, then people will rationally like change their decisions, and so what you end up with is maybe like an actual affirmation of the discrimination and the stereotype to begin with. So it's very like unfortunate, but that's kind of like just how some of the mechanics of like decision making work out. So yeah, I read The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, and then I read some books on like Nazi history and eugenics, and I really wanted to know, like, why would people be so obsessed with like the color of their hair and their eyes, or like why would they be so obsessed with thinking that like there's something wrong with Jews? And so I just read the books. I read Robert Proctor's book, The Racial Hygiene. I read a book called In the Name of Eugenics by Daniel Kevels, I think. I read Mad in America by Robert Whitaker. Yeah, and so all these books touch on eugenics and like the flawed beliefs about like genetic inheritance of IQ and virtues and like just behavior generally. And so I read a lot about that, and like so obviously the vast majority of the science says that those types of things that we judge people on are not very genetically determined. They're mostly culturally determined. And there's like plenty of data that suggests otherwise, but that's what the vast majority of the scientists and generally people conclude, and for good reasons, because it's not good to like discriminate people. But anyway, so a lot of these books mention Madison Grant, The Passing of the Great Race. And I just remember that book always came up like, here's this horrible author with this horrible book saying all this like racial supremacy stuff. And so I would never think to read the book. But while I was browsing University of Toronto Library Archive, I noticed the book, The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant. And so I'm like 60 pages in, and it's like a window into the past, like flawed beliefs. But I mean, we look back on these people and say obviously they were like ignorant and evil, but I honestly try to give people the benefit of the doubt, even people whom I hate. I try to give them the benefit of the doubt, take their perspective. I think, what is it, Robert Wright? He calls this cognitive empathy. Anyway, so I tried to read the book and kind of like take his perspective. Like, what is he talking about? Why would he believe this? And so most of it is like flawed science, like the shape of your head determines if you're Aryan or Mediterranean. But some of it is not all that flawed science. Like the fact of the matter was that, in 1920, most of the good science in like technological productivity and like just like most progressive, like developed parts of the world were Northern and Western European countries and their colonies. So it would be rational in some like flawed sense to just assume that there's something special about Western Northern European peoples, even though it's more of like a cultural developmental thing. Um, but yeah, so I've been reading that, and it's just interesting, just to see like how flawed some beliefs can be. But I mean, they're based on grains of truth. Um, yeah, so I think it's interesting that one thing that we've lost is the ability to just critically analyze work. Um, for instance, people say that like The Bell Curve by Charles Murray is like this horrible, evil, racist book, and it's really not. It's really a book that just takes a bunch of data on the correlations between IQ and like life outcomes, and it just tries to like say like look at all these different measures of life outcomes, and they're all very heavily dependent on like your IQ at age 8 or something. And there's one chapter where it goes into detail about how, as far as we know, there is a racial difference in IQ. He doesn't know if it's genetic or cultural or nutritional or any kinds of other like systemic factors. And I mean, for good reason, we all generally assume that it's mostly cultural and nutritional and other systemic factors. But yeah, that's all the book was really trying to say, The Bell Curve. But yeah, so to be able to just critically analyze work, to just say like, well, in the passing of the Great Race, it was true, maybe, that Northern Europeans were taller than Mediterranean peoples in 1920. But, that's almost certainly due to nutritional factors. If there are genetic factors, that's one thing, height. The eye color, hair color, that is like pretty clearly like just Northern European peoples have that and their descendants. Although it's a recessive trait, so if you're like me and you're like 3/4 Northern European, you probably don't have blonde hair and blue eyes because you could be 1/4 something else, and that 1/4 is dominant. In my case, I'm Native American, but you could be Asian, African, Mediterranean, and yeah, it's a recessive trait, so it wouldn't show up unless you had it on both sides and you were lucky enough, like by Mendelian inheritance, to actually get it, or unlucky, whatever you might call it. In my case, I am Northern European on both sides, even though the one side has Native American mixed in it. So I end up with very white skin, but no blonde hair, no blue eyes. And other factors like my eyes are a bit Native American looking. People misunderstand it to be Asian, but it's Native American. We have the epicanthic fold. So yeah, so like the passing of the Great Race, like just to be able to critically analyze the book and just read it and say, this was true, but the conclusion was wrong, or the step in logic between, Northern Europeans are taller people and they're more virtuous people. Like, so that's because they're Northern Europeans. No, maybe they were more virtuous people, but it's almost entirely due to culture. Like, you could just be wrong about that one thing. So yeah, and the problem is, I think, is that people are just not very well read. This goes back to just the idea that people are not reading a lot of books. People are stuck on their devices or whatever they're doing. They're just not reading a lot of books. They're not learning a lot. So if you were to read The Passing of the Great Race, you just would not have like the information to critically analyze it because you haven't read books on like the science of skin color, the science of genetics, the science of evolution, the science of cultures and anthropology, culture anthropology, Jared Diamond. Um, well, I don't want to go on forever, but I just wanted to like riff on these topics, and well, even if no one watches it, maybe it serves some function anyway. So that's all.